Well, I see we're a big crowd, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining the International Macro History Online Seminar. It's a pleasure for me to be here tonight, or this afternoon for you. I'm Karine van der Beek, and I will be the mediator of this session. Here with us are also Mandy Chow, who will be the host of the webinar, and the organizers of the seminar, Nathan Sussman and Rui Esteves. Hi, and thank you for inviting me to mediate. Today's session is dedicated to an intriguing CEPR discussion paper, Fighting for Growth, Labor Scarcity and Technological Progress During the British Industrial Revolution. The paper is authored by Joachim Voth from the Economics Department at the University of Zurich, Bruno Caprettini, School of Economics and Political Science at St. Gallen University, and Trew from the Economics Department at the University of Glasgow. And I haven't seen Joachim and Alex, but I suppose they are here with us?
No, they couldn't join. But
they will not be here. Okay. So the paper will be presented by Bruno Caprettini, and just a few words before I leave the stage to him. So just the format and rules of the webinar. It will run for an hour and will optionally be followed by an extra 15 minutes for those who wish to continue the discussion. Your questions can only be asked in the Q&A space, and I will later at the Q&A phase, I will read them out to the authors and to the author for him to answer. If you have urgent clarification questions, please flag #clarification in the Q&A space. And only I will be able to stop the presenter for the clarification questions. So I hope this is all clear. Okay, so we can now begin. Bruno, the floor is yours for 40 minutes.
Thanks so much, Karen, for the kind presentation, and to Rui and Nathan for the very kind invitation. So I'm Bruno. This is joined with Joachim and Alex. So Fighting for Growth is about the determinants of growth in England during the Industrial Revolution. And so a good place to start to motivate what we do is to look at long-term growth across the world. So on the left, you have the best estimate that we have for GDP per capita as produced by the Madison Project and elaborated by Odette Galore. And so you see GDP per capita over the past 2,000 years for different regions of the world. Now, if you don't believe this data, and you probably shouldn't, you can look at high-quality data for England prepared by Greg Clark that covers the average real wage of construction workers in England over the past 800 years. So growth seems to be this bug that at some point everybody gets. However, Britain was first. And so over the past 150 years, economic historians have asked themselves what made Britain so special. And of course, they came up with several different answers. Some people like Daron, Jim, and Simon would argue it's mostly about institutions, but other people also came up with other answers like the British culture, the fact that England was an island, it had a very thriving slave trade, and so on. Now, any serious explanation for the British Industrial Revolution has, however, to contend with technological progress. In other words, it has to explain why, at some point around 1800, British inventors and British entrepreneurs started to bring to the market and start to use new machines that made labor much more productive, and they were the true engine behind this industrial revolution. And I think when it comes at technological progress during the Industrial Revolution, it's fair to say that there are two grand theories out there. So on one hand, there is Bob Allen, who thinks it's all about relative prices. Coal was abundant and cheap, while labor was scarce and expensive. And so it made economic sense for British entrepreneurs to adopt new machines that used a lot of coal and very little labor. Joel Mokyr disagrees, and he thinks it's all about human capital. He emphasizes that Britain, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution was unusually abundant of what he calls industrious mechanics. Millwrights, carpenters, blacksmiths, people that didn't have much in the way of schooling or traditional education, but they had accumulated a lot of useful knowledge through on-the-job training. And so they had in their minds knowledge that was accumulated over generations of artisans and millwrights. Now, what's the issue with these two theories? We think there's nothing wrong. In fact, they're extremely insightful to think about technological progress in England during this period. However, the basic limitation is that there can only be one country that goes first. And so when these theories have been tried to test empirically, it's usually an exercise in comparative history in which the experience of England is contrasted with the experience with a few other countries which were advanced at the time, but did not start the Industrial Revolution, like France, Holland, or China. And so the contribution of this paper is to try to formulate these two theories in a way that it's empirically manageable, and try to test this theory with modern microeconomic techniques. And so in particular, we're going to look not at the cross-section of countries, but we're going to look in the cross-section of British villages and towns. And we're going to ask whether we find evidence for these two forces emphasized by Allen and Mockyer. So more specifically, what we're going to show is that places in England that around 1800 were more scarce of workers are the places that adopt the most labor-saving technologies in agriculture. Now, you may be worried that labor scarcity is endogenous, and so the direction of causation may go the other way, or there may be some omitted variable bias that is going to confound this relationship. And so in order to establish causality, we're going to exploit the fact that during the years of the wars against France, military recruitment removed from the labor market large numbers of workers. And so we're going to exploit variation in labor scarcity generated by recruitment intensity. Now, you may still be worried that recruitment itself is endogenous. And so we're going to address this concern by using an instrument that's going to generate what we think is a quasi-random variation in the ability of the Royal Navy to recruit sailors. So this is going to be the core of the paper, and it's going to show what we think is the first credible evidence in support of the theory of Bob Allen. So at this point, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to bring back into the picture the ideas of Joel Mockyer. However, we are not going to be able to develop an instrument, and so for the second part of the paper, I'm going to only show correlations. So what do? We are going to introduce a measure of human capital that speaks directly to the ideas of Joel Mockyer. In fact, it's a measure that was used by Joel together with Karin and Omer in a recent paper that measures the presence of one of these industrious mechanics across England. And so with this new measure, we're going to show two additional results. First, we're going to show that also the presence of skilled labor was important to promote adoption of new machines. But importantly, we're going to also show a complementarity. We're going to show that the places which were more abundant in skilled workers and most scarce in unskilled workers were the places where we observed the fastest spread of new labor-saving technologies. And so these results seem to suggest that the two theories of Allen and Mockyer do not have to be thought as mutually exclusive, and in fact, they may have been complement with each other. So in the last part of the presentation, if I get there, otherwise in the Q&A, we have one last result in which we ask what happens 40 to 50 years later after the wars and after these machines have been introduced. And what we show is that the places where we observe the earliest adoption, so the places that were the first in adopting these new technologies, they still keep an edge relative to the rest of England, and they're still the places where we observe the most productive machines 40 to 60 years afterwards. And so what this suggests to us is that one of the advantages of going first may be precisely the fact that mechanics and engineers have a longer period of time in which they can play around with these machines, and in itself may be providing an advantage relative to other places that go afterwards. All right, so this is going to be the plan for today. I see that there is one question already, or?
Yes, I'm exactly just reading it, so I'll just read it out loud. Uveda Gozan is asking, how should we think about differences in terms of property rights? Do we assume away those institutional differences? I mean,
for the purpose of this presentation, yes. This does not mean that we think institutions do not matter. It's the paper is going to be about other factors, which we also think are important. All right, so this is the plan for today. I'm going to start with giving you some background on the period and the data we use to measure technology adoption and recruitment. And I'm going to use this as an excuse to start by showing you what I think is the most convincing empirical evidence of this paper. And so this is not a graph, it's not a table, it's actually a sentence that was that's coming from a text written at the time of the events. So this is taken from the General View of Agriculture. It's a series of agricultural surveys commissioned by the Board of Agriculture at the time. There's one volume for every county. This is the volume of Dorset, and it's the chapter on threshing machines and winnowing machines, two technologies that were very labor-saving. And it starts by saying that a considerable number of threshing machines have been erected in this county, and nearly all of them within the present century. The principal inducement for using them is a scarcity of laborers, which in a state of warfare may be expected to be felt most in the maritime districts. And so really this is, in one sentence, 80% of what you can expect from today's presentation. To us, it's very important that the forces that we have in mind were actually very clear to contemporaries living during this period. So there is a war. What war is it? These are the years of the wars against France. So for almost a quarter of a century, Britain was almost constantly at war with France. And so the size of the armed force ballooned. The British Army reached 200,000 men before Waterloo. The Royal Navy reached the peak twice. It was a little bit smaller, but still 160,000 men strong. This may sound like small numbers, but of course, Great Britain is a smaller country at the time. So the first census we have, it's 1801, where there are 4.4 million men. We don't know the age structure, but if we assume it's the same as the one 50 years later, there would be 60% prime age men, and so they would make 2.6 million prime age men. So a conservative estimate of this labor market shock is that the recruits accounted for at least 10% of the male prime age labor force. So a massive labor market shock, and one that we think would induce entrepreneurs to respond to this change in labor costs. So we want to measure recruitment on one side and technology adoption. How do we do this? Well, for recruitment, we turn to the master rolls. So these are the equivalent of personal files that were kept by the Royal Navy and the British Army. So both branches recorded everybody who sailed on a Royal Navy ship or fought in a British Army division, because at the end of the war, if these people survived, they had to be paid. And so, luckily for us, the master roll record a number of information, including the place and county where this soldier and this sailor come from. And so a big part of this project was to digitize a random sample representative of the whole armed force, both for the British Army, you see the result of this effort on the left, and the Royal Navy on the right. And so one thing...
Excuse me, just a clarification that I also wasn't sure when I was reading the paper. Are you using the two types combined as one variable, or are they used apart?
So I'm going to show you some result correlational with the sum of the two, but then I'm going to focus mostly on the Royal Navy. This is an excellent point to emphasize this, because as you can see, the geography of recruitment is very different for these two different branches. And so when we think about identification, we have to account for these differences. And so most of the identification, actually all the identification will be based on Royal Navy recruits. All right, so this is going to be the right-hand side variable, what's going to explain technology adoption. Now, we want to observe technology adoption. So how do we do this? Well, we really had two options. So the first one could have been to look for new technologies that spread in the manufacturing sector. Now, we decided against looking at manufacturing because manufacturing production during this period is started to concentrate on relatively few large European centers, London, Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester, and Nottingham. And so if we had looked only at manufacturing, we would have ended up giving a lot of this geographic variation, which we thought would help us pin down the forces we are after. So instead, what we did was to concentrate on agriculture. Now, we think agriculture is a very interesting place to look at because, first of all, agriculture is happening all over Britain, and so it allows us to leverage this geographic variation. And importantly, the agricultural sector in this period is extremely dynamic. And we observe fast mechanization across England, and this mechanization is also accompanied by structural change. And so by looking at agriculture, we not only can exploit this geographic variation, but we can also look at the sector. It's one of the protagonists of the industrial revolution that is happening at the time. There's another question, so please.
No, it's okay. You can continue. It was just this like a typo of 1792 instead of 1793 for the war.
Oh, sorry.
The declaration of war.
Sorry about that. So, all right, we want to measure technology adoption across the agricultural sector. So how do we do this? Well, we start from a list of 11 different machines, which we classify as labor saving and non-labor saving. By far, the most important of our machines are threshing machines, which historians and economists agree was one of the most labor-saving inventions of the time. We also collect information on these three machines, which I assume none of you has ever heard about, the turnip cutter, the cake crusher, and the chaffing machines. These are machines used to process animal fodder. The reason why we think they're not labor saving is because before their introduction, there was no animal feed processing going on. And an agrarian historian argued that before these machines, beasts had to survive as best as they could. So we think that these machines on the right, they're not labor saving because they are performing tasks that were not performed by humans before the introduction. Now, importantly, these three machines are just as expensive and as complex as the other machines on the left. And so to us, they provide a useful placebo to look at how different technologies with different factor bias spread across the same sector in the same period. So this is what we want to measure. How do we do this? The basic challenge is that there is no agricultural census until 1866. And so we had to be a little bit more creative in constructing our measure of machine diffusion. And so to do this, we're going to use two different sources. The first one is historical newspapers, which at the time published advertisement for the sale or the lease of one of these machines. So you see one example of this advertisement on the left, where there are two excellent threshing machines to be sold very cheap. So this is really the equivalent of eBay at the time. And of course, at the time, you wouldn't provide an email address to be reached by potential clients, but you would give a physical address. So we read around more than 3,000 of these articles, and we geolocate these farms and machines on the map of England. We complemented this first source with information from the General Views of Agriculture, which is this agricultural surveys I've already mentioned before. So the result of this effort are these two maps that show the spread of labor-saving machines on the left and non-labor-saving machines on the right. In terms of frequency, we have almost 5,000 machines, of which 4/5 are labor saving. And as I say, that the most common of these machines are the threshing machines. All right, so before I show you our main results with identification, let me give you a sense of this data by showing you some basic correlation. So the first thing I'm gonna show you is a validation of our measure of recruitment as a proxy for the labor scarcity generated by the war. So what you see in this graph on the x-axis is the log of the total number of recruits per capita across England. And again, these are both Royal Navy and British Army recruits. On the y-axis, you have the log of the gender ratio, so the number of women divided by the number of men. The underlying data are 2,600 equally sized cells that cover England. However, we are binning the data into 20 equally sized bins for aesthetic purposes. And so what you can see here is that places that recruited most are also the places in which we find the most skewed gender ratio. So as you may know, gender ratio in nature tend to be around 0.5, so there are more or less as many women as men. Britain at the time had very extreme gender ratio across the entire country, and some places had even more extreme gender ratios. And so what you see in this graph is that the places with most extreme gender ratios are those that recruited most intensely. And so these gender ratios are likely a proxy for these missing men that were fighting Napoleon. Next, let's take a look at the unconditional relationship between recruitment and machine adoption. So again, recruitment is on the x-axis here. On the y-axis, you have number of machines adopted across England. And so when we look at labor-saving machines, we see this very strong and positive relationship between recruitment and adoption of these machines. While when we look at non-labor-saving machines, the relationship is much flatter, and when you put it in a regression, it turns out to be not significant. And so this is a first pass. Of course, it's just correlation, but it's suggesting that the main forces that we have in mind seems to be a play also in the raw data. We can be a little bit more sophisticated, and we can include a whole set of controls: demography, geography, proxies for availability of skills, finance, patents, and we can also add region fixed effect. That the relationship is very strong and positive when we look at recruitment and labor saving. And as you can see, the relationship is there when we look at all the recruits or when we focus only on the Navy or the Army. For non-labor saving machines, these coefficients tend to be much smaller. If we test the difference between the first three columns and the last three columns, they're always significantly different from each other. And with the exception of British Army recruits, non-labor saving machines are not significantly correlated with recruitment. All right, now you may be worried that all of these results are spurious. In other words, you may be worried that there are non-observable characteristics which we cannot control for in our regressions that are affecting both the labor market and so both recruitment and the adoption of these new technologies. Or you may be simply worried that the direction of causality runs the other way. It's the places where there are most machines, where workers have the worst opportunities on the labor market, and they are more ready to join the British Army or the Royal Navy. And so in order to make some progress and to talk about causation, we thought that we needed an instrument. Now, the basic challenge to think about an instrument, you have already seen. So the geography of recruitment for the Royal Navy and the British Army is very different. And so for us, it was impossible to come up with some instrument which would predict both types of recruitment, and it would be excluded from the technology adoption regression. And so in the end, we settled with something a little bit less ambitious, and we decided to find an instrument that would predict only recruitment for the Royal Navy. So the basic intuition behind the instrument relies on the way in which the Royal Navy recruited at the time. So the Royal Navy had almost 1,000 ships at the time, and recruitment on each ship was responsibility of the captain of the ship, which would have to come on shore and find sailors, either volunteers or men that could be pressed into service. So the press was an institution sanctioned by the British Army at the time, which allowed the captains of these ships to force able-bodied men into their service. Now, the basic intuition we're gonna exploit is that the ships of the Royal Navy, especially the biggest one, could not reach all parts of England equally well. And so we're gonna exploit that the ease of access to different areas of England for this Royal Navy ship was very different. And in particular, we're gonna exploit the fact that the biggest Royal Navy ships, those that needed the most men, the most sailor to sail, actually were very high above the sea line. And because they were very high above the sea line, they also needed a lot of draft under the keel. And so we're going to exploit the fact that the depth of the sea along the British coastline, it's very different, and it allows some areas to be reached very easily by these big ships, and some other areas much less easily.
Bruno,
Yes.
can I interrupt you? Because I mean, it could wait. If you decide, you can answer you can answer it in the end. But I think it does require some clarification here, because we have really two types. I mean, we have recruitment to the British Army, which has one geographical distribution, and then the Royal Navy that has another distribution. And in a way, what you are saying is that the Royal Navy, we can like make sure that it will be an exogenous kind of shock, while we cannot do this for the general recruitments. And this is why, and this is why we get this difference, because the results are different, right? And everything is different. So you're saying they're both okay, but one can be interpreted as exogenous. Then this is why we're using it. But then you are ignoring the fact that in the same, like in the neighboring parish, there could be recruitment as well, but it's just like not for the Navy, but just for...
Absolutely. So for this to work, it needs to be true that the British Army is not compensating. So a place that it's a lot exposed to the Royal Navy is not a place where the British Army does not recruit, and vice versa. A place that it's not exposed to the Royal Navy is not a place where the British Army now goes more, so that it exactly compensates. I agree. This, in principle, this could be a concern. I'm going to show you that this doesn't matter in practice, but this is a good point. So how do we make this operation? So we start from a map of England, the coastline of England, and then we draw around the map of England a contour line that tells us which are the closest point out at sea that are at least 15 meters deep. Why 15? Well, the naval historiography tells us that the big ship of the line, for instance, the HMS Victor you see here, they had a draft of around 9.5 meters, and then they required 5 meters extra buffer for safe navigation. And so we take these 15 meters depth as the deep sea, which is needed for these ships to approach the coast. And so our instrument is going to be the distance of every cell in England to the closest point on this contour line that it's at least 15 meters depth. Now, the obvious concern with using the distance to the deep sea as an instrument is that it's going to be very correlated with the distance to the coast. And being close to the coast may affect the local labor market for all sorts of reasons besides the exposure to the Royal Navy recruitment. So we're going to try to address this concern in two ways. First, we're going to always control for distance to the coast. And so the exclusion restriction is going to be conditional on the distance on the direct effect of the being close to the coast. So it's going to be a conditional exclusion restriction. Secondly, and more importantly, we're going to be very conservative, and we're going to restrict our analysis to only cells that are within 15 kilometers from the British coastline. And so for everything you're going to see from now on, we're going to only look at this coastal sample that is half a day walk from the British Riviera, and we're going to exploit the fact that some of these cells lie just in front of the deep sea, and they can be reached very easily by these large ships, while others lie on places that are harder for these ships to reach. Now, before I show you our main results, the reduced form and the IB, let me discuss a few validation exercises that tries to support the validity of our approach. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to try to predict these red dots and these blue dots. What are they? The red dots are places where we know the Royal Navy had a port or a permanent anchorage. These are not the only places where the Royal Navy would go, but these are places where we know the Royal Navy had a permanent presence. The blue dots are commercial ports. In this period of time, most of the trade would be coastal or through inland navigation rivers. And so the blue dots are places where this trade would stop, this trade would stop. And so we're going to try to use our instrument to predict both types of ports. So the first two columns, we try to predict only the presence of one of these two ports. On the next two columns, we predict the distance. So this is going to be the opposite effect. What you see is that places that are more distant to the deep sea are much less likely to be home of a Royal Navy port, and accordingly, they have a much longer distance to the closest Royal Navy port. The second and the fourth column shows you that the relationship with commercial port is much smaller, and it's not significant. Now, this is consistent with the historical narrative, which says that the British Navy, the Royal Navy ships were much larger than the largest commercial ship of the time. Just to have a sense, the biggest ship of the line would be double the size of the Indiaman, which was the largest commercial ship at the time. It's also reassuring for us because it's telling us that our instrument is not picking up things like market access, which may affect the local labor market for reasons different from the exposure to the Royal Navy recruitment. So I have 4 minutes, so I'm going to skip 3 more validation exercises, and I'm going to move on to the main results so that I have time to discuss them. So here you see our first stage regression, in which we use the distance to the deep sea to predict the number of Royal Navy recruits. We are controlling for the distance to the coast, the full set of controls, and in the second column also the fixed effect. And we are focusing on this 1/3 of a sample where the coastal cells around the coast of England. And so what you see is that places, the farther you are from the deep sea, the harder it is for the Royal Navy to reach these places, and the fewer Royal Navy recruits we find. If we look at the British Army recruits, the effect goes sometimes in the opposite direction. The coefficient is much smaller and it's never significant. And if we test the difference, they're always significantly different from each other, as you see on this last row. And so this actually...
Can you just say what is an observation? Like what unit?
So these are equally sized cells around, so it's this map. You probably can make out these cells in this map. All right. So this is important for us precisely for the point that Karin was making. It's possible in theory that the British Army recruitment exactly compensated the heterogeneous recruitment for the Royal Navy, but in practice this didn't happen, and so it generates what for us it's a useful variation that we can use to identify effects. Next, we can look at the reduced form. Here we use the distance to the deep sea, condition on the coast and on all these controls to predict the presence of labor-saving machines and non-labor-saving machines. So the farther you are from the deep sea, the harder it is for the Royal Navy to reach you. We find fewer recruits, and we also find fewer labor-saving machines. When we look at non-labor-saving machines, the effect is much smaller, sometimes goes in the other direction, and it's always significantly different from the first two columns. So to the extent that you believe that the distance to the deep sea is affecting technology adoption only because it's affecting the ability of the Royal Navy to recruit, and through this channel, the labor scarcity, you may be willing to believe our causal statements, and you may also be willing to believe our two-stage least square regression, where we instrument naval recruitment with this deep sea, and we find that this recruitment was a very strong predictor for adoption of labor-saving machines. Again, we find nothing when we look at the other type of machinery. Now, I have 1 minute left, so let me show you what, the last set of results. So all that I've shown you so far try to make a causal statement. Now, for trying to test the ideas of Joel Mokyr, that also skills and the availability of these industrious mechanics mattered for the technological progress, we do not have a good instrument, and so we are falling back on just correlations. The thing we did was to follow the lead of Karin, Joel, and Omer, who had a super nice paper in which they use the apprenticeships fees to measure the diffusion of mechanics across England. And so what we do is to use this measure to ask what's the effect of having one of these mechanics in your town on the diffusion of these machines. And so we have these two additional results. The first one is that the mechanics mattered. Places that have one or more than one mechanic seem to adopt much more of these machines than places that had no mechanic at all. And second, there seems to be an interaction. If we look at the relationship between total recruitment, so labor scarcity, and adoption of these machines, the effect is very different if we look at places with no machines, with no mechanics, places with just one mechanic in red, or places that have two or more mechanics. So it's really the places where there is this availability of skills, the mechanics that respond the most to recruitment and so to labor scarcity. Now, one last word, this is all correlational, so we are not gonna make any causal statement for these results. However, if you're worried that the fact that urban centers have more mechanics, it's biasing our result, we're actually excluding all urban cells, so places with a lot of density, and so at least it's not confounded by urban status. But of course, there may be other confounders, important confounders that are biasing our results. So I'm out of time, so let me conclude and leave the space for question. We study technological progress during the Industrial Revolution. We find evidence of factor bias technical change, and we also document suggestive evidence of a synergy between factor bias technical change and the contribution of human capital to technological progress. Why does it matter? Well, we think this tries to reconcile the two views of the Industrial Revolution, the one of Bob Allen and Joel Mokyr, and it may offer some insights for why the country that fought the most was also the country that industrialized first. And sorry, I was a little bit over time, but I'm happy to take questions now.
So first, thank you very much, Bruno. It's really one hell of a rich paper with sources and stories and ideas. And I see that we have among the attendees lots of growth and human capital people. So I will leave my own questions to the end and honor the attendees. And maybe we can start with Peter Solar who's here. And maybe, Peter, do you want to ask the question directly?
Should I collect questions or should I answer one by one?
Oh, that's a good question. I think if it's short, maybe you can answer it immediately. And if not, maybe leave it and write it down.
Okay.
Peter, did I open the access? One second, is Peter Solar here?
Why don't you read it out? Because I've lost the question in the change here.
Okay, so I'll read it out. Okay. So does the use of these agricultural machines not depend on the local crop mix? For example, the use of turnip cutters, the principal non-labor saving machines was heavily concentrated in East Anglia, where turnips were an important element in the agricultural system. Turnip cultivation would have been quite rare along the southwest coast, where pastoral agriculture was more common. Among the labor-saving machines, threshing machines should have been more in demand where cereal cultivation was important in the south, and in East England, and so on, in the pastoral areas of north and west, etc.
So yes, this is an important point. We try as much as possible to control for this. So the answer is, of course, yes. So these machines are used mostly for cereal cultivation. In fact, mostly for wheat cultivation. The threshing machines, for sure, at the time were working best for wheat. As much as possible, we try to control for this with geographic controls, so with suitability. We also include this region fixed effect, which allow to control for this difference in crop mix. So in our defense, I guess one advantage of looking at all these different machines is that we are trying to cover machines that are doing tasks over the entire agricultural year. So threshing machines are mostly used in the winter, but then we have reapers and mowers, which are mostly used in the summer. So although it's true they might be skewed in terms of what cereal they process, we think at least they are a little bit more representative of tasks that are performed across the agricultural year.
Also with the regional fixed effects, no?
Yeah, the regional fixed effect we also think absorb some of this variation precisely because.
I will let Guillaume ask the question directly. Guillaume, do you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the. Sorry, is that what? Yes, now it works. Thank you very much for the presentation. That was very, very interesting. But I had a question regarding your instrument. I mean, this man of war, they were very expensive. They were very expensive, right? They were very useful to beat up the French. So I guess they were not trampling around Britain to recruit sailors. That would have been a waste of capital. So why don't you use directly the Navy ports as an instrument, and instead make this assumption that this 120 cannon beasts would go up and down the British coast to recruit sailors?
Well, so these ships were so they would be moving around, and so sometimes they would be coming back home for refitting and for repairs. So sometimes they would be going away. And one of the reasons to go back to Britain was to find people that would man this ship. So we think that the way in which they would they would be around Britain precisely for this reason, for finding volunteers and men to press. We are not using the Royal Navy ports because we think that that's a little bit less exogenous instrument, because Royal Navy port will have all sorts of effects on the local labor market. These are places where ships are built, ships are repaired, then there is a victualling going on. So actually one thing we do is to worry about this Royal Navy port that may be confounding. And so we, in some robustness, we drop them from the analysis and show that results actually survive without these ports. So they would be very strong predictor of a Royal Navy presence. We don't think it's as defensible as an instrument as the one we are using now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Maybe do you think you can close the slide so that we can see?
Oh,
the
yes, absolutely.
a little better? Great.
Yes.
So we have a question here from Zuyen Wang, which maybe I will connect to it, also one of my questions. So it's about the like whether the military recruitment itself could have an effect on what we see. So could military recruitment potentially encourage entrepreneurship? For example, might the risk tolerance developed through army experience make veterans more willing to adopt new technology? Additionally, could the networks they build during service provide better access to lending or investment opportunities? And I want to connect to this also that the war itself increased very much the demand for crops, and whether, I mean, theoretically, if your instrument is good, it shouldn't matter. But given that there is specialization that could affect, so I'm just connecting this to the recruitment, to the war itself, or to the effects of the war themselves.
Yes, so for sure the war generated inflation, and agricultural goods were in high demand. We think this is going to be a shock that it's common across England, and so we're exploiting variation across England in recruitment, and we think that this is going to be just an effect that it's more or less the same across the country. The war could so returning veterans could affect entrepreneurship. We didn't think about this. So the thing I know is that the terms of service at the time was for the duration of the war. So in principle, there wouldn't be many returning soldiers during the war. There was the Peace of Amiens in 1801 when the Royal Navy and the British Army started to demobilize. But my sense is that at least until 1820, there were not so many veterans coming back to England. So this recruitment was a persistent shock. When they came back, actually, we have this other paper with Joachim in which we showed that the returning veterans actually revolted against the new machines because they basically lost their jobs while they were fighting. So we may have to think more about the direct effect of these veterans on entrepreneurship, but my gut feeling is that returning veterans were not a major force before the 1820s. Nathan has a question.
I'm muted. Do we have any more questions from the public? Nathan?
Hi, Nathan.
I see the queue is a little bit empty, so I jumped in. So
I'm still here, don't worry.
No, you're still here. Yeah, okay. But we'll still have 15 minutes afterwards too. But anyway, so I'm just thinking about the, so I completely buy the story of labor scarcities and the war and the returning veterans. We had the Joachim present the other paper here a couple of years ago. the Luddites. So, but I'm just worried about the identification strategy. Not that I don't believe the story, but if we're going down the lane of being very precise here. So I think, so for one thing, I didn't see a regression without the regional fixed effects in the deep ports, because these deep ports that were used are close to the French or to the Channel, right? They're not in Scotland or somewhere else, because obviously the British Navy wanted to be close to the fighting zones and not kind of go into deep ports that are elsewhere. That might be used so to see the regional fixed effects, and that's just one clarification. How much they contribute to the whole story in terms of just having a deep anchoring place for the British Navy. The other thing is, which is related, is that is there something peculiar about these big ports that can hold big ships, therefore big ports might have more commercial activity in the first place. You might have more of your wanted ads for machines, more liquid market for used equipment, etc. So there's something about these on your left-hand side variable, the use of machine, which is correlated with these more densely populated, thicker markets for anything. And finally, it's just when if you're gang pressing in a British port, so these people are not people who are thrashing and hanging out on the wharf. So, I mean, it's not the same people. So not necessarily the same people that they were. They didn't go into the villages and collect people. They were, I mean, these people that they gang pressed were sitting in pubs or whatever, idle in the port. I don't think they were the most productive members of the British labor force. So these are three quick questions.
Yeah, so great points. So for the
Maybe just before you answer, because there's also a very related question here from Ethan Itsetsky. Ethan, if you want to later comment on the way I interpret your question, then just make a sign. So it's the same point about whether if these ports are bigger, more commercial, etc. But it's also a little bit related to what I was thinking of before, that the army was also purchasing a lot of agricultural products, and therefore it might also be, these ports might also be used for army purchases, and then the demand would be much larger in these areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So yes, so the region fixed. So let me answer the question of Nathan in order. So the region fixed effect, we have all results for first stage reduced form and two-stage least square with and without fixed effects. I'm not sure about the results of deep ports, so we should look into that. For sure, there was a regional variation in the presence of these ports, precisely for the reasons you said. You have to consider that until the beginning of 1700, the main threat for England was coming from the Netherlands and not from France. So there would be some ports also on the North Sea, precisely to defend against that ancient threat. But we should look into the results without fixed effects. The concern that these big Royal Navy ports may also be home of very active trading activity. So we looked into this. So the thing we did was to digitize the Lloyd's list, which collect. So for one entire year, we know the universe of seafaring travel around England. So we know for every port in England which ship came, which ship went. We know if the ship it's military or if it's a commercial ship. And so we try to use this data to have a better sense of the activity in this port. So the thing we found is actually there was a very clear division between commercial ports and military ports. So if a port was military, it was almost exclusively military. If it was commercial, it was almost exclusively commercial. And so when we look at specific ports, we don't think there's much confounding going on. Of course, it could be that two ports, a military port and a commercial port, are relatively close to each other. And so the thing we do is two things which I think are helpful. The first thing is that you have to remember that all our results only consider rural cells, so cells that in which we observe the density that is below a given threshold. And so all the activity that is going on in a city, actually it's not part of our story because we dropped this observation. We also have a new robustness checks in which we drop all the cells in which there is either a commercial port or a Royal Navy port. This actually halves the sample size, but we find very similar results also in this smaller sample. Another thing I should say about commercial trade and our instrument is that the depth of the sea, at least the 15 meters depth of the sea, was really not a constraint for commercial shipping, because as I said, the biggest commercial ship of the time is this Indiaman, which was used by the East India Company for trading with the East, and this was the draft was 5 meters, and this compares with the draft of this man of ship of the line of 10 meters. So the commercial ships were half the size of military ships, and so they were really not constrained in the same way by the deep sea. And finally, for the demand for agricultural goods that may be coming around ports, it's a good point. I think that this robustness we have, in which we drop all cells around either commercial or Royal Navy ports, actually it's helpful, because it's really telling you that the variation that it's coming from other places without ports, but with or without access to the Royal Navy recruitment, still finds the same results.
Thank you, Bruno. Can we, I'll just maybe like say a few words, and so we can move the next questions to the discussion.
Absolutely.
I just want to make, I mean, 2 comments and a question that we can talk about later on in the discussion. The small comment is about the apprenticeship data. It's available till 1810, and if you need it, I can happily send it. About the engines that you use in your paper, the Kanevsky engines, you should make sure that it's relevant, because they are the use of these engines is discussed, is like mentioned in his paper in the list, and most of them until the 70s are for mining, and then mostly for textile with the rotation patenting. So I'm not sure how much, like in this period, at least until after 1800, it's relevant. The bigger question I want to ask you is whether you think this is still like a British story, an English story of the Industrial Revolution, or is it just that you're saying, look, this is like where we tested in England, but this is a general phenomena. This is what the model tells us. This is what the economic logic tells us, and we're looking at it in England. Or is it really something that is combined with something unique in England? But then I'll stop here for those who maybe want to leave us at this stage. And I want to remind you all that in 2 weeks, we have the next session. So this is the moment to remind you that in 2 weeks, we have the talk by Stephanie Ettmeyer from the University of Bonn, who will present the paper Fatal Austerity, which she authors together with Alexander Krivolutsky, Moritz Schularik, and Lukas to stage. And for those who wish to continue the discussion, we have extra 15 minutes. I remind you that this is all still recorded. And then we will officially close the webinar. So I just want to ask my co-hosts here if now the microphones for everybody are open, or do we still need to follow the Q&A? Rui, Nathan, please help me out here for the discussion.
You still need to follow. I mean, if people want to ask questions, you can unmute them if you want. Yeah.
Okay, great. So maybe let me see if we have something that is connected. Okay, so maybe I'll be glad if you relate to my own question, because it is like, you know,
absolutely.
Again, this, are we still talking
crucial.
about special England, or is it just general phenomena?
Yeah, so I'll say 2 things about the comments you made on the apprentices. Thank you so much. We should share data, because we digitized it with some AI. Maybe we can improve both databases. I don't know if you digitized everything. We are using apprentices until 1792 deliberately. So we actually digitized the full thing, but we are using apprentices that are predetermined to the war. So in a sense, we are trying to be very cautious in terms of what goes into the regression, although this is still a regression that is not identified. The engines, I agree, that's not necessarily measure that it's very relevant. For sure, it's not a measure that it's absorbing lots of variation. We thought that we would include that because it's a proxy for the existence of some technical skills that were good enough to set up one of these engines. But I agree, most of them were used in mining. So the most important question is what do we learn from this that is general? So in particular, I think that so one way to ask this question is to ask why didn't this happen in France? Because France actually had even more recruitment than England at the time, and it's not the country that we first associate with the Industrial Revolution. So I'd say two things about this. The first one is that in this period, we actually observed a lot of technology adoption in the French manufacturing. So if you look at the surveys of the Napoleonic Wars, for which I'm working for a different project, you observe that spinning jennies and frames, they are spreading very fast across several regions of France, maybe in part as a response to this recruitment and the labor scarcity. We don't have data for technology adoption in French agriculture, but there is one thing that made British agriculture special, and so it may be specific to England, and maybe one of the things that helped Britain go ahead and be the first industrial country. And so what really special about Britain is that even before this wave of mechanization, which we document in the paper, British agriculture was extremely commercialized. So this is not the type of agriculture you would find in Africa today. These are not peasant farmers that are running a family farm with lots of surplus labor. This is a commercial enterprise, which the land is owned by the lord, which rents it to the farmer, which is really an entrepreneur, which rents the land, rents the capital, hires the workers, and then sells all the product on the market. And so this is a context in which there's much less slack than there would be in a peasant agricultural setting. There is not surplus labor. And so if you remove some workers, especially if you remove so many workers from the agricultural sector, then you would observe higher labor costs, and you would observe the farmer entrepreneur react quickly to these changes. So what's special about Britain, maybe it's that this labor market shock happened in a context in which the agricultural sector was already quite productive, and for sure it was working under market conditions. Does this answer?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but we do have limited time. I'll just relate to a question by Jacqueline Adams, and I think maybe I can just say, like, maybe you want to say 2 words about it. She's asking whether maybe it's not about this recruitment of sellers, but rather that the entrepreneurs were better and you know, better connected people, etc. But I think Jacqueline, maybe Bruno wants to say something about it, but this is in a way what they're trying to prove by the regressions and by controlling and using the IVs and everything. So theoretically, this is randomly between entrepreneurs that are on average the same, right? Do you maybe want to say something more about it?
Yes, so that's the idea of the instrument. So what we show in the paper, I actually had to go fast, is that this instrument seems to be quite orthogonal to all characteristics of these areas, and so we hope that it's generating some quasi-random variation in the tightness of the labor market. I think Rui wanted to ask a question.
Rui, go ahead.
I did. great paper. That's the first comment. It has lots of things I like, including the Royal Navy. So well done. And the death of the sea and gang pressing and all of that. Now I have two questions. So everyone was trying to poke holes in your identification. So let me try. Here goes my broadside. It's very small. We're deep into the decreasing returns. So labor market and market access. So was there not a labor market in the UK? Are these effects really that localized? Couldn't you source labor force? Wasn't there incentives for people to migrate where the marginal productivity of their labor and hence the compensation would be better served? And market access, right? So we all know that, captains had Royal Navy captains had a difficult enough job as it was. On top of it, they had to recruit, quote unquote, their crew. So of course they try to do it along the coastline, but the coastline also happens to be, economic joggers will tell you, some of the locations with the highest market access. Is that not going to have an effect on the entrepreneurial incentives and the technology adopted and so on? Right, we usually measure distance to rivers and roads, but the coastline as well. So.
Yeah, so excellent question. So the first one, it's about labor market integration. So of course, migration could undo all of the effects of the recruitment. In practice, migration was very costly at the time. So of course, there is the cost of migrating, the transport costs were bigger, the communication costs were bigger. So all of this would make migration less easy at the time. On top of that, there were the law of settlement. So at the time, there was this very rudimentary welfare system in which people could be taken care of by these poor rates, but only if they were living in the same place where they were born, where they were settled. And so this created these incentives to move away, because if you move away, actually you lose all these entitlements. In practice, this same law of settlement also created all sorts of constraints, because if you wanted to leave, then you need to have a formal document that it's signed. The parish was not obliged to sign this document. So in practice, we think migration was relatively hard at the time, and there are some historical studies that show that the migration we do observe was mostly short distance, and so we think that this is part of the reason why the effect remains localized. So actually, looking into this, we figured out that Adam Smith, no one less, commented on the law of settlement and says that this is the reason why we observe such difference in the wage rate in England, because places that are very close to each other, they don't manage to equalize wages because people cannot migrate from one place to another. So this, we think, it's the reason why there's still useful variation in our data. For the market access, I think this is crucial. We don't have a silver bullet, but we think that the fact that we are looking only at coastal cells, it's helping in reducing this issue. So we're not comparing places which are on the coast and they're very exposed to the Royal Navy to places that are very much inland.
Sorry to stop you there, right? Your instrument is actually the depth of the seabed on the coast. Yeah. Right, so if you're in some godforsaken place in Cornwall, it's as if you have no access to the sea, right? Because if there's shoals, if you cannot get the location of harbors is endogenous, of course, so you're trying to avoid that by looking just at the depth of the sea. But the depth of the sea is a pretty good predictor of whether on that cell you have market access or not.
Well, but then we would be able to predict the presence of these commercial ports. So that I guess that's our answer. That it seems that in practice this instrument is not predicting so much the existence of a trading port, and it's mostly predictive of this Royal Navy presence. Okay. I don't know. So I mean that's our test for the importance of market access. You don't seem entirely convinced, but
No, no. I'm not convinced or other convinced. I thought you would, throw me some test you had done, right, to dispel this, right? Because the set of harbors in the UK was not necessarily fixed, right? So the argument you throw at me is essentially predetermined, right? And I can live with that, right? The same way that you answered Karin earlier on, you said, I use the stock, the lagged stock of these mechanics, right?
Yeah.
You're essentially telling me the same. I'm using the lagged location of these
those parts. Yeah.
We only have like 2-3 minutes, so I will push a technical question because I was really like I'm not sure I even understood it correctly while reading the paper. So I mean, when you read the idea and everything, then you would expect to see a difference in difference regression, right? So you have before and after, or at least to see like that your data structure is a panel. And I somehow didn't manage to completely figure out like what is the structure of the data, what is an observation, why don't you have like an event study of before and after?
Yeah, so we thought about this, and this would have been my preference. So the structure of the data is very simple. It's cross-sectional. So we have adoption during the Napoleonic War and recruitment. I would have liked to have a diff as you suggest. The issue is that there is no pre. So if you look before, there are basically no threshing machines in these areas, and also we find very few of the other machines. So if the British newspaper archives starts from 1700, there is not so much density until the mid of the century. We search on the whole archive, so we are not constraining ourselves. But in practice, we find very few machines before the war, and this is actually the same thing we find in the general views of agriculture. So for some counties, we have the general views for 2 different years. For instance, Arthur Young covered Suffolk twice, once in 1797 and once in 1804. And in the second edition, he says there were no machines 5 years ago, but now they're everywhere. And so this is not the only place we find that. So it seems that the big spread is really happening during the war. And so in a sense, we don't have a pre because it's all zeros. But and so you can think about adoption as the first difference because the T-1, it was 0 everywhere.
Yeah, well, theoretically, you could also do like a staggered diff in diff, like every year there's like no,
Yes.
okay, but then it would be in the same locations. Okay, yeah, but I mean, even if it's moving from 0 to something positive, it's still a change. It's not. I mean, I would try that because it would like this panel setting will kind of quiet lots of the worries that are raised.
I agree.
And you can really do real fixed effects, and not only on the like a large region, but really on the spot itself.
So that's true. We didn't do this in part because I'm a bit worried that so the data is still very sparse and we don't think we're picking up all the machines. And so I'm worried that if I start to do this being even not just 1 year, but like 5 years, it's going to be mostly zeros, even more than it is already now. So that's the unsatisfactory.
So I'm sorry, I'm stopping you in like while you're answering me, but I must say that I am convinced, like Nathan said, it's a very convincing idea and a very beautiful setting. I love the data. It's interesting. And I mean, it was a joy to mediate the session. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you, everybody that attended. I hope we got to all the questions, and see you in 2 weeks.
Feel free to reach out if you have more comments, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Bruno. Thanks,
Karin. Thanks, Bruno. Thanks, Karin.
Thank you, everybody.
Great talk.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.